the International Science Council is calling on the United Nations to establish an advisory board to look at solutions to deal with future pandemics. That's as the world has seen more than 6.3 million COVID-19 related deaths. So should the global community not act, the Council says there are a number of possible scenarios that could unfold. Let's speak about those. Let's bring in the Council's Professor Salim Abdool Karim, who joins us now via our video link. And Prof, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks as always for making time. I want to begin perhaps by placing the work that this Council actually does before we hone in into these scenarios that the Council has outlined.
Good morning. Good morning to all of the viewers. The International Science Council is regarded as the global voice of science. It includes many of the world's academies and scientists across the world, thousands. And as the International Science Council, our principal task is to understand, promote, and enhance science across the globe. One of the things that the Council undertook shortly before I joined as its vice president was put together a group to look at what does the future hold in COVID-19. And what they did was brought together just over 400 of the world's top scientists to apply their minds to that question. And what they produced were three scenarios: a likely continuity scenario, a failed recovery or missed recovery scenario where things would get much worse, or a collaboration plus scenario where the situation would improve. And it basically is telling us we have the ability to choose that future. The decisions we make will influence whether we take the high road, whether we continue as we are now, or whether we take the low road.
That's interesting. Let's speak a bit more about the collaboration scenario if we can. And I'm asking this because so much has been said about what COVID-19 has been able to reveal when you think, for instance, about the inequity in the distribution of vaccines, for instance. How effective can a global advisory panel be in a context where we faced those challenges when it comes to collaborating around responding to the pandemic?
One of the key recommendations that comes out of this report is that we need to fix the current system. And that system focuses on basically what we call the multilateral system that's under the United Nations. Because if we are to tackle this pandemic's future variants or the next coronavirus, we are going to be in a situation where we have to be working more closely with each other. There is no scenario in anything you can look at that shows that we would win this battle if, some countries are very successful in mitigating and controlling the virus while the virus is spreading rampantly in others. There's no scenario like that. We are dealing with a pandemic. We have to stand together, and we need the basis on which to be able to tackle this problem as a world united. Now, we understand that that's not, something that's readily feasible, but with a pandemic treaty, an agreement by all countries, which is currently underway, to come together under a set of rules that would allow a much more coordinated response to the pandemic. And that response should be informed by science. And so one of the recommendations of the report is the creation of a United Nations Science Council to bring together scientists from across the board, not just medical people, but, economists, anthropologists, and so on, so that we can have a holistic response, not just to this pandemic, but to many of the challenges we face, like climate change and so on.
Yeah. If the scenarios, if the worst case scenarios are to be averted, I imagine the council that you're part of is also putting timelines to this. You'll speak to me about that in just a moment. But as you do that, there is a scenario we are hoping the world takes. But I wonder whether there's also a scenario that you reckon is likely.
When we look at what's going on with this virus, it is dictating terms to how we are going to be subjected and have to deal with this pandemic. And it's dictating terms because we are not being, as a world community, we are not being proactive. So each new variant is upsetting the world cart because it's creating a situation where we now have to go back to the drawing board, scampering, waiting, watching the cases rise. We have to figure out how we're going to get ahead of this. How are we moving into a situation where we are better prepared, and in the event of new variants arising, we have ways in which we can identify them, mitigate their impact, and reduce their spread. Now, we don't have that in place right now because we don't have a global approach to dealing with new variants. And that's one of the things that this report highlights, that we have to come together under the UN to be able to achieve this. Now, this is not going to be achieved simply by science. It's actually a political process. But what is important is that science underpins that process.
It's an interesting connection you're making, because what we've seen in the past 2 years at least is science taking up a much larger portion of public discourse than what was the case perhaps, arguably 5 years ago. In what ways does that complicate the work of scientists? Because initially, as a scientist, you just needed to be good at the lab stuff. But now your communication is also quite important, especially if you're trying to spread messages around really complex viruses.
Well, you've touched on what has been transformative in the last 2 and almost half years, and that is that a scientist like myself, we generally will stay in the back room. Our task is to crunch the numbers, look at the data, do the research, produce the evidence, and provide it to policymakers. And then they make the decisions, and they make the announcements, and they are the people who deal with the consequences of those decisions. We are just in the back room. What has happened under COVID is that the scientists were brought out of the back room and put into the front room because people wanted to understand what's going on. But it's not just that they want to understand what's going on. They also want to be much more involved. So today, the number of people who are in communication with me because they are busy analyzing data, lay people, but they are looking at the trends in the deaths, and they're writing to me, I know, aren't you concerned about this? Are you, is this correct? And I'm thinking to myself, science has become much more in the public discourse, and it has become a much more empowering tool. People of all walks of life are now owning that science. Previously, when people ask me what you do, I said, I'm an epidemiologist. They said, oh, you treat skin diseases. Now, ask everybody, what's an epidemiologist? And they know. He's the one that looks at epidemics. So I think for me, this has been an enlightening period. It has been a popularization of science, and it has been taking science out of the ivory tower and empowering people to understand their world.
Hopefully that'll also become useful if we do find ourselves having to deal with any future pandemic. Professor Karim, it's always great speaking to you, sir. Thank you so much for making time. Professor Abdool Karim, Salim Abdool Karim, I should say, is the Vice President of Outreach and Engagement with the International Science Council. Thanks once again.